Hello and welcome to Lightways at Life Astrologer with me, Anna Isabel, and Joy of Joys. I am with Victor Olliver today. Hello, Victor.
Anna, it's been too long, but here we are.
But here we are. And today you have kindly stepped in to discuss a brilliant book with me. And it is Liz Greene's Chiron in Love. And so, well, what there were a few things that stood up out for me with this book, and maybe the first one is the because we're used to Chiron being about the wounded, the wound,
The wound and the healing.
and the healing. But what I love right at the start is that she's now talking about Chiron in the context of the wounding. What did you think of that?
Well, she makes observations which I think are unique to herself. I mean, yes, she acknowledges the wounded healer, but then her great strength is then to go back to the actual mythology and ask herself, well, what are we really saying about this story? So we know that Chiron in myth was a good man horse. You know, he's a sort of hybrid, isn't he? And I always feel that we've forgotten the fact that he's born in shame. His mother is ashamed of him. So even though that's not acknowledged in itself as part of the pain, but she's so ashamed of him, she turns herself into a linden tree. It's wonderful psychology, though. But then the actual injury, just to go through the myth for a moment to then answer your question, the great injury he suffers is through in battle, you know, a poisoned arrow. It's been poisoned by Hydra. And of course, he's immortal as well. So his fate is that he will have to suffer awful pain for the rest of eternity. And because he's wise, because he can reflect, he then has to understand, well, what does this mean in practice? I cannot live this way. And ultimately gets into an exchange with Prometheus so that he can become mortal and die. Now, a lot of people misunderstand this. They think it's assisted suicide or something. Divine assisted dying, or whatever you want to call it, whatever the euphemism that can get past various conscionable people, he said slightly outrageously. But the point of the matter is, I see it more like this. The wound, whatever it is, whether it's psychological, whether it's physical, whether it's emotional, somehow at some level we have to internalize the fact, not try to remove it from existence, from our memories or from our consciousness, but to somehow understand the reality of it. Because the next stage, that if you live, I mean, not all of us are going to have to die in order to escape some terrible pain, but the wound is actually part of our evolution.
It is. And, you know, just coming back to what you said about shame, it is the thing that I always stress when I'm introducing Chiron to my students is this story doesn't begin with his birth. It begins with the circumstances of his conception and the ensuing shame around that is then projected onto him. And I think that that's very, very important because neither wound is his fault. And that's the thing, is that neither wound is his fault. But I think it's, what do we do with that? Because there are times in life where every human being is wounded and it is not their fault.
Exactly.
It's not because you wished for it. It's not because it just is. And that, I think, is where it's really important what Liz has to say about this. And I've written a quote down. Healing Chiron's wound doesn't lie in the fixing of the failings of society, creating a perfect world, and never experiencing hurt, rage, and envy again. It lies in each of us coming to terms with the roots and the nature of our own individual suffering, bitterness, of victimization, and finding ways of working with these experiences creatively rather than trying to cure them or finding someone to blame. And I think that statement is at the heart of all healing. And she's talking about it in the context of Chiron. And it's exactly as you said. We then have a choice when we are faced with these moments where pain has been inflicted upon us and we are truly innocent recipients of that pain. What do we do? Do we, A, pretend it hasn't happened, which some people try to do, with it's like the consequences of that are never good, because you're either going to sublimate the pain through compulsive behavior, i.e. addiction, or you're going to sublimate the pain by passing it on to somebody else, because you're passive aggressive, whatever, however you want to do it. Or you try to live with it in a martyr-like way, and it kind of begins to eat at you, and your health goes down, etc. So that is not a good option. The other option is to be enraged, the victim with righteous anger, who's going to change the world and impose their own version of utopia on the rest of us. And hey, there's a lot of that going on. That's not a good option, because that's not healing either. Ultimately, as she says, we have to A, accept that this has happened, B, accept that we are in pain, and then be creative about it. And as you were describing what happened to Chiron, he himself is not the one who barters for his to become mortal in order to leave. It's actually it's Hercules who's accidentally wounded him, probably through his own thoughtlessness and carelessness.
Yes, it's all done to.
Exactly. Yeah. And he's the one who steps in and has this creative idea.
I think there's an important point to say here. I mean, the thing to understand about Liz Greene's book is it's actually based on a lecture she gave in 2005. And the point of the matter of that is she is delivering this talk, but it involves audience participation. And I remember at some point in the book, somebody asked the question, but what about cause and effect in the material world? What if you're abused or in some way, there's a lot of it about. She acknowledges, the roles of Jupiter and Saturn in the material world. They're both, to some extent, planets of consequences. We don't normally say that of Jupiter, do we? But she makes the rather intriguing and lovely point about Jupiter, is that Jupiter sometimes has two faces. And if you think about the judicial process, it's all about, for and against, whereas Saturn is more strictly is the consequential planet. And there is a place for the cause and effect. But Chiron doesn't invite us into that part of the world. It invites us into our own world to see what we can process of the pain, of what's been done to us. Because, as you say yourself, she says, there's too much blaming as a kind of solution. You quoted something. Can I quote something to you, which is a variation on what you've just said? It's interesting we picked these similar quotes, but this is quite a controversial area, which you may want to comment on. She says, I do not believe Chiron's wound can be entirely healed because it is related to our experience of being mortal, flawed humans and the collision between our ideals of a perfect world and the reality of the world as it is. That's quite controversial. Upset a few people in the audience, that observation. And not all astrologers agree with her, by the way.
You see, as a therapist myself, I get asked this a lot. Am I ever going to be free from this pain? In other words, is this wound ever going to heal? And A good example of that, for instance, would be a bereavement, the pain of bereavement. And the answer to that can never be black and white because everyone is different. Is it possible to heal all wounds? Let's rephrase that. Is it possible to transcend pain, the pain of being human? I think that for some people it is, but that in order to do that, we have to define what we mean by healing. And it is very different to curing. See, when people ask the question, they're really asking is, can the pain be cured? And what that means is, can it be erased? And, you know, you can't unsee what you've seen. And in fact, now here's an interesting take on this also. A few months back, somebody rang me up to ask about hypnotherapy. And I was explaining the process of the techniques that I use. And it is called transformation therapy. And the way that we regress the person back to the initial sensitizing trauma event, whether it's a big trauma or a small trauma, it doesn't matter. And then, because in the state of hypnosis, we are both relaxed and aware, the ability to learn and to see new perspectives that we hadn't seen before is maximized. So consequently, we can not erase the memories, but by bringing in new perspectives in a state of hypnosis, we can make connections we'd never made before. And that hopefully brings in a new perspective, which allows us to be free from being haunted by the event. Now, what this person said to me is, oh, but you know, that's not real because what happened happened. And I said, well, it's not a time machine. We're not going back to undo the event. What we are doing is finding a way, and as Liz Greene puts it, of creatively being able to work with the memory, work with the material, so that the perspective of it changes and we can be free from the way in which it haunts us. And I think that is healing for me. Now, does that mean that the person is going to be free from pain forevermore? I guess the question would be, are they still going to be, to take a very used word, triggered? Probably not in the same way. So is that complete healing? So I can have clients who get to a wonderful stage where they feel at peace with themselves. They feel at peace with the past. But every so often, maybe every, 2-3 years, when life bites them again, it throws them just a little bit. And they come back and they go, oh, I thought I dealt with this. It's bugging me again. And I say, it's okay. Let's deal with that. And we're just coming at the same thing, but from a different angle this time. And here's the thing. Instead of needing 6, 7, 8 sessions, this time they've needed 2 hours. And it's
Yes, I mean, that's a good measure, isn't it? And it's wonderful as a therapist that you can see Chiron in action. The ideas we associate. I mean, Liz Greene, although on the one hand she says we cannot look forward to complete healing, that's an unrealistic thing, because we can't, unless you want to get into erasure of memory, which is something I wouldn't recommend, because you're not going to learn anything. It's like going back to a default option, and the power of it may still reside there, but you can no longer remember why. But she does talk about coming to terms with the roots of one's pain or wound, which actually I think summarizes what you've just described in an essence, trying to understand the roots. But the inclination to do it must start in what I call the patient, or just the individual who's seeking to address whatever it is. When we talk about pain, I mean, just to bring it down to earth, we could talk about somebody who's the subject of a criminal action, or somebody who's betrayed. I mean, Liz Greene does say quite revolutionary things. At one point, she says that betrayal, the good side of betrayal is that it ends illusion. But of course, it can so easily generate bitterness and cynicism. So I always have to laugh when people say astrology is all about fixed outcomes and determinism. I mean, they're so naive that these days I can't even be bothered to. I mean, why bother? I mean, if they can't be bothered to learn the subject which they so ridicule, really they're not even deserving of a response. Of course, one does want to enlighten. But the amazing thing is that everything in the process of healing is a lot to do with what we choose to do, which is not easy.
It isn't. And I think I just want to come back to the end of Chiron's life, because what is it that frees him from pain? It is transformation.
Yes.
Humility and transformation. And I think when we look at that question as to whether a wound can be healed, I feel it can be healed to the point where we are at peace. It doesn't mean that we're going to be at peace and not be rattled by things that happen. It's just that the level to which we are rattled decreases. It's easier to cope with. So there is that. But it can only happen when my clients come in willing to change, and they have reached the point of humility where they can say, I can't do this on my own. I think I need somebody to help me. And I think that that's the other thing about the story, is that he cannot do it on his own.
No.
You know, he's this amazingly famous healer, but he can't do it on his own.
No.
And if his friend has to step in and ask for divine intervention.
Zeus.
So yes, because that is divine intervention. And he has to suddenly be mortal. And what is that about? That's about transcendence. It's about transformation for the point of transcendence. He has to transform in order to transcend the pain. It's very easy to get stuck on the fact that he had to die. But I think that that's meant to be about transformation or
Death is seen as transformation. And of course, he's rewarded in a certain way. I think it's Zeus, he's so impressed by this act of courage, if you want to call it that he's then granted his place in the skies, in the cosmos, you see. Well, I can't say they were all going to get that fate, but in mythical terms, it does suggest the reward for accepting the reality of a situation, then having a certain humility to seek help.
I think also, you were talking about the stars, the fact that he's up there, celebrated, the
We're talking about him now.
Yeah, the constellation of the Centaur, Sagittarius.
Indeed.
But I think you can almost come back to fate and say that he's fulfilling his promise, the promise of his very existence. Because I hadn't thought of this before, but he's a hybrid. And so this is about, and Liz talks about this in the book as well. This is about being in a state of duality. And this is about being kind of a halfway. You're not one, you're not, and you're the other. And how, because, I mean, if you think of the archer as we see him depicted in Sagittarius, it's that arrow, and it's aiming at the sky. And so this is about the desire to transcend and to connect with what is higher.
The higher. Yeah.
And the horse part is its instinct, and it's the link with the earth, because it's animal, and it's reminding us that we are in fact part of nature and the animal world. But it's the desire to transcend. And so when you think about it, it's almost like the fulfilled promise, you know, aiming at something higher. And
it's a wonderful story.
Yeah.
Wonderful story. I mean, also to remind people, I mean, centaurs tend to be identified as groups, but we know of Chiron, and the centaurs are not always essentially good. They can be very naughty. They can be cruel. So there is that duality in a moral, spiritual sense as well. I mean, Chiron, it so happens, is born good. I think that's the way I read it. He seems to have a natural inclination to be the teacher, the mentor, the healer.
And he's civilized in the sense of the word, because he is raised by Apollo. So he has the good fortune of being raised by Apollo, who is a god of culture and civilization, etc. So there is that. There is Pholus and there is Nessus, and Nessus is definitely a more controversial character, if we can put it like that. Pholus was very respected. Nessus dies in infamy, I think. But it's yes, I think that he stands out from the herd, if we can put it like that.
Well put.
Yeah. I was going to say from the crowd, but that just didn't feel right. Because yes, it's the others do operate as a herd. You know, because they're not human. They're wild. And nature, and I think this speaks to the fact that nature is not Disney. Nature is the beautiful herbs in your garden, and the kittens and the puppies and all the things that we love, the sunshine and the sea. But the sea can drown, the sea can flood, the sea can bring you tidal waves, and the earth can bring you earthquakes and volcanoes. And we don't fare very well if we stand in the way. So nature is both. Everything is both.
Oh, yes.
And so, and we have to kind of be respectful of the power of nature and respectful of our own instincts. And so there's Chiron. And I think that that's the centaurs too. The centaurs are not cozy. They're not cozy.
No, they're not cozy.
You know, they are wild. And it's that wild, untamable side of nature. But that doesn't mean that they are necessarily malevolent or bad, because remember, there is this bias from our perspective looking at them as equating wild with bad. And that's a whole other subject. But Chiron doesn't fit into that.
Absolutely. And I mean, Liz Greene, I wouldn't say she's a political astrologer. I don't think she uses astrology as a vehicle. But she does make observations about modern life in the sense that there's this tendency, the cradle to the grave, let's try and make this as painless a utilitarian paradise as possible. And of course, we then end up with a complete bureaucratic mess. I'm not going to question the good intentions behind this, but the problem is that it discourages people to actually internalize difficulties, which can be the building bridges for further. Now, that may be easy to say. If you're talking about deprivation, it's easy to say that and get the wrong end of the stick. But we're trying to focus our minds now not on all that Saturnian, Jupiterian, Jovian energies, which look after the material world to some extent. We're trying to look into the soul, look into the way the mind works, and that's very much your area, I think. Certainly Liz Greene's area, she's a psychological astrologer, and very Jungian in her approach. And she's very much about the projection of pain on others. So you get passive-aggressive measures. And even when I was listening, all the scandals are going on at the moment about child abuse and one thing and another. Of course, these things have got to be addressed at a material level. There's no question about it. But there's this constant search. Let's conduct the witch hunts. Yes, to say if the guilty must be found. There's no question about that. But I don't think it helps then to institutionalize the pain side so that it becomes something that cannot be resolved, that cannot in some way come to terms with. This is a dangerous area to go into. But we don't want to rob people of their personal power.
Three words that I have come to shudder, that have come to make me shudder. The law must be changed. And the reason I shudder when I hear that is because it's usually uttered from a place of pain and anger. And if followed, and ignoring the fact that laws have already been broken, existing laws have been broken, actually what we need is people to be brought to account.
Of course.
That's what we need. But that need to fix everything often leads to more pain. And, as you were talking, I was thinking about how hard it is for parents to resist the temptation to overprotect. I find it difficult to not overprotect my dog, and I have to stop myself from that, because if I do, I am robbing him of the opportunity to be himself. And that's what you're talking about when you say, trying to make the world so safe that people are actually disempowered and can't think for themselves and can't act for themselves anymore. And that is what Liz is talking about in the book. And it's what we need to be aware of, because this is actually also about our own discomfort in witnessing other people's pain.
Oh, yes, absolutely.
It's not real empathy. No. It's, I want you to not suffer so that I'm not hurting watching you suffer.
I'm afraid that there is that variation on the theme, which comes within the chironic theme, if you like, because the wound and the hurt comes in all shapes and forms. I mean, don't people out there misunderstand me about this. The law has to take its course. What's signally over and over again repeated is that the law really is an ass. But more particularly, those supposedly responsible things are recurringly failing in their duties. And then we come up with another annoying phrase, let's learn some lessons. And, it's a tragicomic cycle. Now, this is not just me mouthing off, but at some level, one way of taking control, I mean, you can't expect that of a child necessarily, but at some level, to open some space within the mind to actually understand the nature of the evil that we're talking about that causes abuse. I mean, we know what we're talking about here, but there are so endless variations around the world at the moment, our wonderful world, is that by kind of denying all that and saying it's a bit of mumbo jumbo, it's just mythology, blah, blah. There are great psychological truths to be found in these mythological stories, very sophisticated psychology. And if you don't like the word psychology, well, call it spirituality then. But it's all about retaining one's independence or finding one's independence, one's inner power. And what the state tends to do, and I'm not some conspiracy theorist, by the way, but what the state tends to do, it tends to rob us of free will and the choice to go forward or to kind of drown in self-pity or tears.
Yeah.
It's a hard message. It's a hard
message. And I think that, you know, again, what we are doing is we're showing the different, or we're talking about the different ways in which this shows up. It shows up in a wider social sense, where we have the social scapegoating that goes on, manipulated, I think, by certain forces who want to garner public opinion and aim it in a particular direction. There is certainly some whipping up going on
definitely.
Over different things, and you can see that all through history. So there is that. There is the scapegoating that goes on within families too.
Oh yes.
Where, you know, one person becomes the focus of the family's energy as everything gets projected onto them. That goes on at that level. You can see it in the workplace, where, you know, sometimes somebody becomes the focus of negative attention. You can see it in the playground. This is where, you know, the bullying comes in.
Yeah.
So it's there. We're looking at human nature in all the different permutations of society. So it's there. And of course, we cannot do this as children. We cannot have this level of self-awareness. And yes, there is no question that as adults, it is our responsibility to protect children from things that they are not going to be able to handle on their own.
Absolutely.
No question about that. As I said, I have difficulty enough not overprotecting my dog. So that is obvious. And as a teacher, when I was a teacher, goodness me, was I protective of my children. It's just that we need to be aware of ourselves. And if we don't have that level of self-awareness and we don't attend to our wounds, we are more easily manipulated by others. Whether it be manipulated into fighting somebody else's battles, or whether it's through being so easily wounded, or it's because we don't have the inner faith in ourselves and inner strength to deal with the blows that life throws at us. In fact, we are so much weaker. And for some, that translates into the desire to control others, to hurt others, to harm others. It's obvious that happens. Look at history.
The cyclic nature. Liz Greene deals with all that.
Exactly.
And it's fabulous insights into the whole thing. Again, let's just remind ourselves, we're not suggesting that this is an easy process. We're all subject to it. It's not like we're sitting on some stage looking down upon, I mean, I can think about my own state. If I look at my own chart, I see that Chiron is at the apex of the nodal axis. It's a T-square in the 12th house in Aquarius. And I relate to that very much, in all sorts of different ways. So astrology enables you to look at the graphic version of yourself and to make sense to some level. But the process of understanding the roots of one's problems can take a long time. Astrology alone won't help you, but it will help to identify certain issues. And going back to the earlier point about society, I'm not anti-society in the least, but I think as astrologers, we do have, shall we say, a role to play in shedding another way of looking at things. And it always amazes me when people say, oh, but you're trying to disempower people by telling them things that they don't really need to know. And I find myself utterly baffled by this, since the starting point for the chart is yourself. And the whole thing arises out of the self. And what you're trying to do is to aid the empowering side so that you're not defeated by life. And this is the thing about powerlessness. You tend to feel, I can't do anything. I can't do it myself. Oh, and society's letting me down because I'm not getting what I want. In other words, there's the externalization going on when actually there's so much potential power within oneself through the processing of information, the understanding of what effect this had on you and that in the other. So it's a big subject. It's a very big subject. For such a little tiny planetoid comety thing, it's like Pluto. Oh, it's that little titch thing over there. My God, it powers a punch. Because we're not talking about size queens here, people. We're talking about symbolic, mythological power. And I know that's a whole new way of looking at things, but that's what we're talking about. We're talking about power, mythology, and I'll come back to that word, self-empowerment.
Just listening to you there, these stories were stories that our ancient ancestors would have grown up with, which means that they had a way of expressing and articulating these different ways of being human, or these different aspects of being human. As we lost the stories, as in they stopped being a very live aspect of our culture, it kind of falls to astrology to bring them back, to bring back these concepts, to give us back a way of articulating what it feels like to be human, what it is to be human. And it's interesting that it's as we discover these new things in the sky, and we have to name them, then suddenly we start reconnecting with those archetypes. And as we reconnect with those archetypes, we're given back the means to process, the means by which we can process certain aspects of being human and being alive in our time. And so I think that there is a beautiful synchronicity here. As Liz points out, we haven't been living with Chiron, as in the discovered Chiron, for very long.
Yeah.
And yet it's so obvious that it's an important part of a chart because we are resonating with it. We can see what it's, what it means.
Yes.
And we're going, oh, yes. Nothing else in the chart told us about that in quite this way.
Yeah. This is the whole point of these. I mean, it was discovered in 1977. So it's still a work in progress. You could argue that everything's a work in progress in astrology. But certainly, excuse me, as you know, I completed a horary course working with the 7 traditional planets. Nothing wrong with that. But the aims of horary are ambitious, and we are using a very sophisticated system. But already the outers are being factored in as secondary considerations, even by very traditional astrologers. And I don't think we should fear the growth, so to speak. I mean, I'm not a great one for cluttering up the horoscope with 1001 You know, I had made a joke the other day about Pam Craner, I love to death, who I have the card as a master astrologer. And I said, we're throwing the kitchen sink in through it soon, because she does the tropical, the sidereal, the dwad, the draconic, but she's got a mind for that. It's rather like some people can spin a lot of plates all at once. I can't spin one plate. So I try to keep the chart as simple as possible. But there's no question, coming back to the point you just made, that Chiron sheds a very, very valuable insight on the nature of dealing with pain and abuse. And it's difficult, it can be easily misunderstood. It's interesting contrasting or comparing her book with Melanie Reinhardt's book, which is also a great book. Melanie, I feel, takes in the broader themes of therapy and spiritual evolution. Liz Greene is a great one for the mythological side of it, the history. She forensically deconstructs and then puts it back together again. Because over time, we get a kind of impression, oh, it's this, it's that. People, I get tired of the phrase wounded healer. But once you go through the Liz Greene book, you realize with the greater dimensions, shall we say, or more dimensions, what that actually means.
It's interesting that you mentioned Melanie's book, because I love that book so much.
It's a great book.
I love both books. And I think that they are both brilliant, but they're coming at things from slightly different angles. But essentially, the depth of understanding that they bring is extraordinary. And Melanie is one for myths too. You know,
oh yes,
the myth is, and the depth of the myth. So I think that there is parity here in the sense that the myth is at the heart of both books.
Yep, no question about that.
But of course, it's two different astrologers looking at the myth in the same way.
Yep.
But with slightly different lenses, which is what you would expect from two individuals.
Well, it'd be daft otherwise, wouldn't it?
Exactly. And consequently, what you have is a richness in both books. And aren't we lucky that we can have both?
We can have both.
We can have both.
Don't be greedy.
Yep, absolutely.
It's not an either or, because they're very complementary.
Yeah.
And also the thing that some people wonder about the title, Chiron in Love. There is a big section on synastry, relationships, things like that. I was intrigued. It's funny, in one bit of the book, she talks about Amber Heard and Johnny Depp. Well, we won't go into too much of that, will we, people? But I was very interested to be reminded that her Chiron sits on his sun, which is square Mars-Pluto, his Mars-Pluto. And that would make, I'm not going to go into why I think that's pertinent, but the popular perception of the relationship does actually match the alignments. If you think about the role she played, at least in the early part of the marriage, and then the rather convulsive, potentially violent side of it too. So what she tries to do, and what she does do, is to connect the two charts, to see who's Chiron in this relationship, and where is Saturn in all this, where is Venus, where is the moon, you know? And it's interesting to see how synastry and Chiron are so potent.
It is absolutely the case. Looking at Chiron in synastry, as I have done, that you can see that Chiron is often very present in relationships that are intense, whether they endure or not. He is present. And I can remember doing a workshop on Chiron in synastry maybe 2 or 3 years ago, and one of the participants asking, so how do we know who's doing the wounding? And it's a fair question, except life is so much more complicated because my wound can make me behave in a way that provokes you, that in a way that wounds me, because my wound and my way of dealing with my wound accidentally detonates a mine in your psyche. And I did not know that because I'm only aware of my wound. And so, why are relationships so challenging? Personal relationships are so challenging because we don't always label our baggage neatly to say, oh, this is yours and this is mine. And I tell you what, why don't you keep your baggage? You tell me where you want to keep your baggage. Okay, you want to keep it over there. Okay, fine. I'll keep mine over there. And we'll just keep them apart so that we don't get in each other's way. And everything else we can have in communal areas. Oh, if only. If only.
And why are we, I mean, she asked the question, I can't remember whether the audience answered this one. Why are we drawn into relationships of a particular kind that could be fractious in the further, which is a variation of what you just said. But why are we drawn to people who may cause us pain or discomfort?
My answer to that is very simple. I think we are experiencing the Groundhog Day, where we are reliving the same circumstances with different people until we work it out.
Yep.
And I can't put it any more simply than that, because I had a client recently who, honestly, the first hour that we were together, my sessions are 2 hours long. The first hour that we were together, and it was the first time that we were meeting. And incidentally, this was an exact Sun-Pluto square that she has in her chart. Was a litany of horror stories in the recent past, like within the last 2 years.
Right.
And then I was looking at something in her chart, and it wasn't the Sun-Pluto square. I can't remember. It was something to do with the moon. And I asked her about her mother. And oh my word, the story that she told me about her mother was exactly the same story that she was telling me. With all these other characters, it was a repeating story. And she could not see that it was a repeating story. Yeah. And I asked her, I said, it was with women, these women that you are telling me about, can you see anything in common with them? And it took her about 2 minutes, it took her a couple of minutes to think it through, because she went for the obvious. And then I said, yeah, but there's a bit more. Can you? And then she said, oh, yes, they're all women of a certain age, and they're all telling me exactly the same thing. And I said, oh, okay, that's it. You've got it. That's great. Is there anybody else that links with in your life? And suddenly she saw it. Oh, it's my mother. And they're telling me what my mother always says.
Oh, God.
And it was like this huge moment of recognition for her. But what that was illustrating was how we replay our parental relationships again and again and again in different contexts. It could be with our employers. It could be with our, very often it is with the partners that we choose. It could be with our friends even, but and also sibling relationships too. You know,
Oh,
that's another one. So it's the sibling relationship. I think it was a moon Chiron thing that I was spotting in her chart, actually, funny coming to think of it. Um, but it's, we do replay them. And I think where it changes is when we A, recognize that the person we're looking at is not really the person we think we're looking at, but our mother or our father.
oh, that's interesting.
So when we are no longer projecting, because this is
Mm.
also, we're attracting, but we're also attracting people onto which we can project the image. So we don't know we're doing it, but it's a subconscious thing. We go, oh, you remind me of mom. Great. I can just cast you in that role. We don't know we're doing it. Of course, we don't know we're doing it. Of course not. We are completely innocent at a conscious level, but unconsciously, we're also attracted to what's familiar. And then we are hoping, really, really hoping that this time it will be different. Not just in the way that we think, oh, this time it will be different when we enter into a new relationship. It's so much more than that. It's maybe this time I'm going to be loved. Maybe this time I'm going to feel safe. And it's not about the marriage that broke up, 3 years ago. It's about the relationship that could never be between mother and child or father and child. That's what it's really about. And I think that when we recognize that, we're already on the road to being free. But then comes the work of doing the healing and doing the self-parenting that was not there, so that we're not looking to somebody else to do that for us.
The great power that resides within, shall we say, the theme of abuse is that it's either not recognized or not seen at all. It's like I'm working a lot with Black Moon Lilith at the moment, and there are, although it's not about the themes of Chiron, but one of the themes that is coming very much to life in my mind, I mean, I won't say too much about Lilith, is that its power resides in unleashing. And all the power that works against you is when it's hidden, or a taboo, or a stigma, or this or that. Now, I know Chiron is not in that territory as such, although it can overlap in terms of abuse and hurt and wound and all that. But Chiron's approach is, I think, maybe more subtle, more gentle in a way, maybe not quite the right word, because after all, if you're stirring up awareness of the roots of pain, you've actually got to relive that pain as well as it was experienced in order to take you down a certain route. I really do feel that. I don't see how you're going to call the thing by its name. I'm simplifying a bit now, unless one looks at it fairly and squarely. But it has to be a gentle process. And if, of course, I'm not telling you to suck eggs, by the way, but the therapy, a good therapist is going to do it in as pacific a way as possible, I would have thought.
The word delicate is extremely important. And you're talking about facing it square on. Sometimes people cannot do that because it's re-traumatizing.
Yeah.
And so I have to find different ways of working with them. The quickest route is to face it head on. It's the quickest. But we're not things that can be reprogrammed, thankfully. We are still human, despite the better efforts of some people to reclassify us. But it is very delicate. And even when my clients are facing it directly head on, I am very careful to help them to have almost like a buffer, some cushions on which to fall, so that we're able to move beyond that. Because the last thing I want is for re-traumatizing to take place. Yeah. So we either do it head on by going straight to the sensitizing event and and working to, as I say, reshape and bring in new perspectives, etc. Or with others, we have to find a different way of telling the story, a way that doesn't take them back there, but still opens up the door for healing. And that's, there are ways of doing that, but you have to be extremely creative when we're working with the psyche. Yeah.
Big subject, eh?
It's a very big subject. And so I think it's time to remind everyone that the book we are discussing is called Chiron in Love by Liz Greene, a link to which will be, you will find a link to it in the description box. And Victor, what are you up to? And how can people find you?
Well, my website, said coughing up blood, is victorolliver.co.uk. That's Oliver with two L's. I've launched a new magazine. I edit the Astrological Journal, but I've got Stellar now, which is free online, and you can find that at the Astrological Association website. That's astrologicalassociation.com. And it's been a busy few weeks, Anna.
I'm sure it has. So you're now editing two things, essentially.
Well, wouldn't you expect anything less from a Gemini?
Absolutely.
It's always got to be twos.
Well, otherwise it was going to be lopsided, wasn't it?
I mean, the thing about Journal, it's still there. It's a membership magazine. But I did feel of late that we weren't reaching the potential audience with it because it's specialists, for professionals. And I'm thinking, why are these hundreds of thousands of people going to this side and that side on the astrology? Why aren't we getting a bit of the action? So I said to Wendy Stacey one day, the chair, I said, we've got to do something, And then Stella got created. I was having a Pinot Grigio one day, and it suddenly came to me. It may have been a little sparkle in the wine. Oh, Stella. And so it's free. It's developing. We're getting the advertising. It's getting thousands of readers. So it's a very exciting time for the Astrological Association as it finds a new audience. And that's what we've got to do. We've got to work with social media, not just keep whining about Elon Musk and all that. Let's work with these great big platforms, even if sometimes they get a bit wobbly. But certainly Stellar is designed for people who are au fait with social media and they want bite-sized chunks in their attention. It's good. Bang, bang, bang.
Excellent. Wonderful. I will make sure that there is a link to
very sweet.
Everything.
But make sure it's the full address. I say this to everybody because at the moment it's HTTPS and then the rest of it. Yeah. And it's got to follow that format. Otherwise you're going...
It has to be a live link.
You'll go to some... I won't go tell you where it goes. But it's just one of those... But it's so fantastic having a conversation. I always learn a great deal in our conversations from you, Anna. And your background in psychotherapy is fantastic combined with astrology.
Thank you. I feel the same about your work. So it's always
very sweet of you.
Fun. And so at this point, I want to thank everyone for watching and also to remind you to follow me on Substack. I have recently started writing. It is, you will find things about astrology, but you will also find things about plants and herbs, particularly, and also read the stories of the Mummy and Teddy adventures, which will make you smile if you love animals. And I will be putting a link to that in the description box too. Next time, we are going to be looking at more wonderful aspects of astrology. I will leave you in suspense. Until then, goodbye.
Bye-bye.